I am not a huge fan of platitudes. Matter of fact, I would wager that most people who grew up sort of routinely questioning everything that people said to them is a big fan of platitudes. They don't really serve the point to get to the truth of any given issue in any given discourse. They're just there to reaffirm people's unjustified beliefs. They are thought-stopping cliches, not arguments, though they will end any kind of argument because that's what they're designed to do. Somebody gives you a platitude in response to whatever you just said. What it means is, I refuse to engage with this idea no matter how good it is, how well supplemented it is with evidence, or whatever you have, because I will retreat into my comfortable bubble of knowing whatever it is that I think I know. So it's kind of ironic that one of the worst platitudes is said by people who use it to proclaim to be questioning things. History is written by the victors. No, it's not. At least not in the way that you mean it. Of course, in many historical conflicts, the voice of the party that won that conflict, which is actually more the exception than it is the rule, may well be louder than the one of the party that lost the conflict. At least when it comes to ancient history. When we look, for instance, at ancient Greece, or even better, ancient Rome, we have all this talk about the filthy barbarian tribes to the north that needed to be enlightened by the glory of Rome. Enlightened meaning, colonized and enslaved, of course. But they were all uncultured heathens. They're literally the way they talk is bar, bar, bar. So who cares? Of course, they weren't actually uncultured heathens. They had their very own many different cultures there because there were many different peoples that lived in what we now refer to as North Europe and Central Europe. We just only see the Roman perspective because they didn't record their history in books, and sometimes, very often, didn't even have a written language at all. They simply chose not to, or were unable to, create texts that would survive to record their perspective throughout the ages the way the Romans did. The same is true about the Anglo-Saxon Christians of Lindisfarne, and also the whole general area of that part of England. During Viking times, when the Vikings were Vikinging, you read those texts, they're all portrayed as wild savages, just unfathomably evil people, literal demons in some accounts, which at some point probably did spawn the myth of the horned helmet type Viking, because that didn't actually happen historically. Which, in this case, it isn't even all that clear that the Anglo-Saxons were the victors of this entire conflict, but they are certainly the ones that wrote the history. And I don't think I need to tell you that, of course, their perspective was highly biased by their own cultural values, and to a large extent, self-interest. All they saw is a bunch of heathens with this rough language, these gods that they were told evil, demonic entities by the church, and they are high out of their gourds on meth, and they just raid villages, annihilate people and shit. Of course, you're gonna have a negative interpretation of that. They were not aware that this was just one minor aspect of a very vibrant and complex culture over there in Scandinavia. But hang on, if history is written by the victors, right, or by at least the people who can write, how do we know about the culture, the vibrant culture of Scandinavia? How do we know about that? Because they didn't write it down. Well, it turns out, and this is true, that history is actually a highly complex academic field, as is its sibling archaeology, which is primarily concerned with the kinds of cultures that didn't write shit down, because its field of expertise is the material culture, so all of the things that you can find from those time periods. Whereas history is more about the written records, but of course, there is a lot of overlap between the two disciplines if you want to be accurate about shit. And I don't know if you've ever read a historical or archaeological paper, but basically most of them, half of the paper is, How do we figure out the biases of the people who wrote about all this? How do we figure out our own biases now that we're writing about this shit? How do we figure out what of this is even actually true in the first place? And depending on the time period, this can present you with a whole array of vastly different problems. Because in antiquity, a situation that you will often encounter with the chroniclers of those time periods is that you will read a text that starts out with, look, I was in Corinth, in this taberna, I met this guy, John Smith, and we got completely shit-faced, and he told me about how all of these battles happened that happened in the last 100 years because he was at all of them. But at least in some of those conflicts, you will often have conflicting accounts by other cultures who are also writing, who will then basically say, actually, you read that writer who wasn't at that battle who said that the people that are my ancestors were little bitches. Well, I'm here to tell you that actually the people who were his ancestors were little bitches, and also he is a little bitch. You talk about medieval Europe, most of the texts that you have that even concern themselves with writing anything down that's happening at the time were probably written by monks who work for the church, which was the preeminent political power at the time. So if you're a historian, you're not gonna just believe anything that they tell you straight up. This is why the farther back you go in history, the more papers follow the structure of, look, I have this huge analysis of all of the data that we have on this. I went through the minutiae of what everyone said, that their orphaned cousin on Crete said, and my conclusion is this is my theory, but also I have no idea if it's true, and also we don't know what happened at all. And then someone will read that and go, yeah, well, actually, I also have looked at those things, and I have a completely different theory that is exactly as valid, potentially, and also we do not know and need further research. Because at that point, there just isn't enough information, or verifiable information, evidence, to be sure about anything at all. When it comes to actual, real, trained academics, aka historians and archaeologists, the most history is written by the victors thing that will ever happen to you is that they will go, look, we have a million different theories, we don't know which is true. But let's be honest here for a second. Most of the time, when people say history is written by the victors, they will then launch into something about how certain cardinal directions initiated certain conflicts because of certain aggressions, or how certain doors were made out of wood, and that is hella sus. They're not talking about ancient Rome, is what I'm trying. It's not that kind of people. They're talking about periods in history where everyone was recording everything all the time. There's a metric fuck ton of evidence for both history and archaeology to work with, and under those circumstances, the statement, history is written by the victors, applies even less than anywhere else. Historians are actually very good at filtering out the historical biases or even present biases in the texts that they work with, because it turns out half of that fucking field is about discerning truth from propaganda. And it gets a lot easier to find other viewpoints on the same thing and to assess how trustworthy they might be, because you have a bunch of different factions who were involved, who recorded their stuff. You have a bunch of different factions that were not involved, who recorded their stuff. And it won't just be political propaganda, you will have intelligence briefings. You will have truth of the matter type shit. You'll have dissident papers. You will have just private artifacts like letters that frontline soldiers send to their wives back home. There is actually such a huge amount of evidence that it presents a whole different array of problems to work in that kind of field. And history is also very equipped to handle that. And one of the big problems in that field is revisionists. The kind of people who go, history is written by the victors. editors who will put a lot of money into obfuscating as much of the evidence as possible so they can spin their narrative that is in line with their political agenda. Because of course, you know, recent history more often is relevant to current history. I'm not asking Italian people for reparations because they enslaved my ancestors or because I was born in an Italian colony. That shit was like 2,000 years ago. 5 JonTron videos came out between then and now. But historians and archaeologists are actually wise to this kind of bullshittery and obfuscation because that's their job. That's literally what they do. They actually look at the evidence and try to discern the truth instead of just going with some narrative. Now, this isn't to say that historians are always right. Of course, individual historians will often have their own opinions. There's a lot of them who will be swayed by the vast sums of money that certain revisionist societies will pay them, but even the larger field of history as such, the assembled experts, are sometimes wrong about things. There have been several so-called black legends where historians propagated something that was incorrectly assumed to be historical fact due to political propaganda, which is why modern historical departments at universities and well, most other institutions are actually paid by, like, think tanks to do revisionism. But let's say that some of them are actually fine. What these organizations do as organizations, you know, subscribed to the ideals of scientific inquiry, is question the discipline of history itself. For a long time, it was believed that the Spaniards were uniquely savage and horrific in their treatment of Native Americans, in their systemic and brutal eradication of their culture. Most of that was actually just English and Dutch propaganda, because they were their enemies in the geopolitical arena of interests. I mean, it's not like the Spanish didn't commit their fair share of atrocities. It's just that they weren't worse than the others. Historians were not only able to cut through that bullshit with their, you know, methods of analyzing past propaganda, but they were also able to dismantle those lies without swinging in the other direction, but with the kind of nuance that you would expect from professional academics who subscribe to the ideals of scientific inquiry. They didn't just substitute one narrative for another, they actually went ahead and tried to find the truth. Because it turns out, and I know this is very difficult for believers in histories written by the victors to comprehend, historians are actually kinda good at, like, history. The more controversial the issue, the more questioning of the narratives has occurred. You can be basically 100% certain of that, because that means there is an increased interest in researching that particular subject matter. So we find ourselves at a point in time where history is probably more accurate than it has ever been. Probably still not 100% entirely accurate, because a lot of the questions we will just never resolve, but certainly a lot better than before. They can present you with overwhelming amounts of direct and corroborating evidence for pretty much any claim that they make, because that's the standard by which historians operate these days. But let's be honest here for a second. If you're the kind of person who says history is written by the victors, probably not the kind of person who really cares about all the evidence. You care about some of the evidence, of course, you know, circumstantial evidence that, if you interpret it very in the correct way, take a lot of leaps of logic, and ignore all the stuff that says that isn't true, supports your narrative. The entire point of that sentence in any sort of discussion is to dismiss evidence that does not support your point. It's you accusing the historians of being, you know, evil spin doctors or at least victims of bias, when ironically, you are either an evil spin doctor or, to give you the benefit of the doubt, a victim of bias. And that, to me, is just the funniest bit. Thank you very much for watching this video. Like, comment, subscribe, share this to your relevant communities, but do not spam them. Consider supporting me on Patreon or subscribe, start buying some of my merchandise or my short story collection. And in that spirit, Don't believe everything you hear or read on the internet, and that fully includes this video, but also don't think because you did your own research you have a better understanding of the issue than people who have been doing their own research in a highly critical environment for their entire professional lives. And see you around, cunts.